Hey everyone. So, one of the issues plaguing podcasters and podcast editors is the issue of latency. Latency is kind of a tech term that refers to the delay that you might get when, for example, you're recording a podcast over the internet. The internet is great. It's a great tool. It has enabled podcasting in general, but unfortunately, there are some issues that it presents, and one of those issues is latency. So, you might not notice it while you're recording your podcast, especially if you have a good internet connection, but you will definitely notice it when you download the audio and listen back to it later. Latency manifests as long pauses or silences between one person talking and another person talking. So if the host asks a question of the guest might take a couple of seconds to reply, but those couple of seconds are going to be incredibly distracting for your audience, and they're annoying to deal with because the only way to get rid of them is to edit them out. Now, recording software like Riverside and Squadcast, they can do their part in mitigating some of that by syncing up your audio, but it's never going to do a great job. So you're going to have to do it manually in post-production. Now, Riverside and Squadcast and Zencaster, those are great platforms, and I do recommend recording using one of those platforms if you're going to be recording a podcast over the internet with guests and co-hosts that aren't going to be sitting in the same room with you. However, like I said, they cannot do anything about internet latency, so you're going to have to deal with that yourself in your DAW or digital audio workstation. Speaking of DAW, we'll take a look at one today. But I do recommend that you go ahead and get yourself a DAW. One in particular that I think is a fantastic DAW that we're going to be looking at today is called Reaper. And Reaper is a very powerful DAW that is also very affordable, surprisingly affordable. Most good high-end DAWs go for around $200 to $300, maybe even more. Adobe Audition, in order to get access to that, you got to pay like a subscription fee of around $20 or $22 a month. I'm lucky enough to have access to Adobe Audition through work, so I don't have to worry about paying that fee. But it can add up and it can get pretty expensive. So I do recommend checking out Reaper because it's very affordable and because you get an essentially unlimited free trial. Though I do recommend, if you like it, paying for it. It's not very expensive. It's only about $60 to $70. I do want to talk about a couple of tools that you can use, one in Reaper and one in Adobe Audition, that will help to make the process of removing silences a whole lot easier. Adobe Audition has a very powerful tool called Delete Silence, and that practically automates the process for you because, unfortunately, removing silences is a long, tedious, arduous, time-consuming, annoying process, and no podcast editor enjoys it. It is probably our least favorite thing to do. So, but again, like I said, you don't want to not do it because your podcast, it's just not going to retain an audience if you've got these weird long pauses throughout your podcast. So you do have to do something about those silences. Now, you don't want to remove them completely because silences can be good for punctuation. They can be good for emotion, for drama. But like I said, you don't want them to distract your audience. So you need to do something about them. There are a couple of tools, like I mentioned, one in Adobe Audition that I just talked about, and one in Reaper that we're going to look at here today. Now, for this video, I'm going to do a little bit more than just look at a tool. I do want to provide you a little bit of a sense of my podcasting workflow, not really in detail from start to finish, but just kind of the beginning and a few highlights along the way. So we'll go ahead and take a look at Reaper for this. And the first thing you'll notice is that my version of Reaper doesn't really look like yours. The reason for that is Reaper is a highly customizable DAW. So I've set my instance of Reaper to function the way I want it to, and you can do the same if you end up using Reaper yourself. The first thing that I want to do once I have downloaded all my audio tracks, and a quick word on downloading audio tracks. If you're recording on something like Riverside or Squadcast, which again, I highly recommend using one of those platforms to record with guests over the internet if you're not in the same room with them. Once you've gotten all of your audio tracks, you do need to make sure that they are that you have an individual track or a separate track for each person that was in your podcast. Do not download the fully mixed version from Riverside or Squadcast because it makes editing a pain. It's practically impossible, not technically impossible, but practically impossible. And tools like what I'm going to show you here called Dynamic Split just won't function properly for you or effectively in any way if you have just one track with everybody. So download a separate track for each individual that was on your podcast. And then you'll have multiple tracks. So in this instance, I have me, my co-host, and my guest. And once I've brought in all of the audio and set them to tracks, then I'm going to line them up. Fortunately for Riverside, tracks get synced up pretty nicely. So lining tracks up is not really all that difficult. There's minimal lining up that I have to do, just a tiny bit of tweaking from time to time. So once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and normalize the audio. This is an important step because while you're editing, you want things to sound the same. You want all of your podcast people in your podcast to sound the same at the same volume. Sorry, not sound the same, but you want it to sound at the same volume, and you want your waveforms to be more readable. And for tools like Dynamic Split, which you're going to be setting some volume thresholds, you don't want people talking to be accidentally cut out of the track. So you want to normalize your audio. So the way I do that at this point, I do normalize again later on in my process, but the way I normalize at this point is by normalizing to peaks. So I select all by hitting Control A or Command A if you're on a Mac. And then I right click on any clip and click Item Properties. Now for me, I've got Item Properties already docked here because I've customized Reaper. Your instance of Reaper, again, is going to look very different. So you'll have to click Item Properties, and then that'll take you to this window. So for this purpose, I'm going to just click Normalize, set the True Peak. I select True Peak, and I set it to -1. I click OK, and now it's going to go ahead and normalize. So now that we've gone into, now that we've done our normalization, you'll notice that the waveforms are a little bit more readable. My co-host's track is, unfortunately, there was some moments in here where she peaked already very close to -1, so that prevented it from normalizing anymore. There are other tools that I could use, but for now I'm going to steer clear of that and just go ahead and dive into some of the other tools. So now we're going to go ahead and start the process of editing. And what I was talking about before, removing silences, one way that we can make that easier in a program like Reaper is what's called Dynamic Split. So go ahead and once again make sure that all of my tracks are selected by hitting Control A or Command A, and then I will press the D key, and that will bring up my Dynamic Split options menu. So I go through here and I just make sure that the options that I want are selected and the ones I don't want are not selected. So that includes selecting when gate opens and when gate closes. I set my minimum slice length to 30 milliseconds. I believe by default it's 50. You can probably fudge that number. Minimum silence length is around 3000 milliseconds. That's probably a good place to leave it if you want it to sound natural. For the gate, I set the threshold to -31 dB and the hysteresis to -16 dB. These are set at -30.5 and -15.9, which is just fine. And then I check display gate threshold in media items. For the action that I want performed, I want the selected items to be split. So I select that. I leave set new item time base to beats because we're not working with music, we're working with a podcast. Leave this unchecked. That says set snap offset to peak value within first 50 milliseconds, leave that alone. Check the box next to remove silent areas because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here with this tool. The leading pad you're going to set to around 70 milliseconds and the trailing pad around 300 milliseconds. Again, you can fudge these numbers a little bit, but the important thing is you want to leave fade pad unchecked because what this is going to do is it's going to add a fade in and out at the leading pad and at the trailing pad, but the entire length of that pad, and you don't want that to happen because that's going to create fades that are way too long. 70 milliseconds is too long. 300 milliseconds is way too long. We do want a little bit of a fade, but we don't want them to be that long. Leave create chromatic MIDI item from slices unchecked and then click split. And now you notice that all of the silences have now been removed from the timeline. So remember when I mentioned to leave the fade pads unchecked? We're going to add our own here. So you'll notice when I zoom in on this clip, it's just the hard cut in and out of the clip. Now, for most of it, it's not going to be an issue, but in some cases, you might find that those cuts are very harsh. So we want to remove that as much as possible. So we're going to go ahead and set some fades here. So the way we do that is we go back to our item properties. For you, you'll, well, actually select all, make sure all of your clips are selected, right? And then we will right click a clip and click item properties. Again, for me, it's docked. So I have everything here. And then I'm going to go ahead and set my fades to about 30 milliseconds. So that's 0.03 seconds here and 30. And then I click apply. And what you'll notice here when I zoom into this clip is that there's a fade at the beginning and at the end of each of these clips. So now we're all set to begin the process of editing. So if you like to keep a running list of the places that need to be edited while you're recording, I do recommend doing that. While you're recording, keep a list of all of the edits that need to be made. And so you should have a list of timestamps. So what you're going to want to do is go ahead and make those cuts, but you're going to start that at the end of your timeline and work your way back to the beginning, because any cuts that you make are going to affect everything happening later. So your timestamps are not going to line up when you're making cuts. So you make those cuts from the end and move to the beginning. And then I do what I like to call cutting at the boundaries. And basically that just means you're going to cut at the beginning and end of where people are talking. And I do that from start to finish. So, I'll go back to the beginning and I'll look for the places where somebody starts talking and where somebody ends talking. And I'll just listen to a couple of seconds here and there. And I make sure that all of those sound clean and natural. And while I'm doing that, I also look for some of those gaps in the audio. So the whole point, one of the points of using a tool like Dynamic Split, like I was saying, is there's going to be issues with latency. Latency creates those silences. So I look for some of those gaps. I believe there might be one somewhere around here. So this is a gap here. So then I look for those and I try to bring some of those clips closer together, remove some of those silences. Now, while you're doing this, you do want to listen to what you're doing. You don't want to just blindly start moving clips around. But if you edit or cut at the boundaries, that makes that initial edit a whole lot faster. And then after that, I go through and I listen to the entirety of the podcast and make additional edits as needed, cut out any parts that need to be cut out, so on and so forth. But what I do for that run through is I actually end up speeding the podcast up, so I'm listening to it at a much faster pace. But that should do it, actually, for this part of the editing process. I think in a follow-up video, what I might do is talk about effects and normalization to LUFS. Those are very important. For effects, you do want to add some EQ to your audio, and you do want to clean things up, try to remove as much noise, background noise as possible. You want to make your audio sound as pristine as you can. This is important for making sure that your audience will stay engaged in your podcast, because nothing turns off an audience more than bad audio. And so you're going to want to do that by adding effects. And I can go ahead and talk about that in a follow-up video. But for now, I think this video has gone on long enough. We've talked about this part of the editing process. Hopefully this was helpful for you in finding a way to cut out the silences in your audio and in providing a little bit of a sense for what a podcast editing workflow might look like. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. And if you have any questions, hit me up in our Discord server. And I hope to see you around there. Good luck on your podcast creation journey, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.